Thank you for filling your drinks and being back. It's wonderful not to have civil disobedience amongst this community, and that all of you are as punctual as you always are. You know, we've been talking a lot about politics and creativity and everything else that comprises our society. But the one thing we haven't had enough conversation around in Algebra is the entrepreneurial life. You know, we've talked of the economy, but we've had very few business leaders, very few entrepreneurs. And indeed, if amongst all our network of guests and members, if there are people that you can help us draw into our Algebra conversations, please do so for our next season. But it's, again, very wonderful that we are ending our season with a conversation around entrepreneurship, because after several governments have promised creating jobs, 10 million jobs, 100 crore jobs, we've finally, we've got Digital India, Stand Up India, Make Up India, New India, we've had all the slogans. And then finally, particularly with this regime, we've come around to saying that basically it's about time that everybody stood up and made jobs for themselves, create the entrepreneurial gene in India, because really the idea of formal jobs is pretty much drying up. So it's great to have Ronnie Screwvala here today, who started out life as a toothpaste manufacturer, who started out life even before that as someone who was interested in theater. And it's very unfair that someone, a lanky young man interested in theater, should end up where Ronnie Screwvala is today, sitting on thousands of crores of capital created purely by the dint of his imagination, his tenacity, and his ability to spot opportunity. So he moved from that to cable television networks, to creating UTV, which was a film production house that was bought over by Disney. And then in his second innings, he is now interested in the digital space of e-gaming, in the sports world, back again to cinema. He's got a foundation called Swades, which looks at rural infrastructure and creating livelihood in rural India. And he is interested in the education space. All of these diverse interests really captures the kind of potency that entrepreneurship in India has. The one thing that distinguishes Ronnie is the desire to move the needle. Any enterprise that he takes up, he wants to break ground and create a completely new landscape. And he's been doing a lot of that. At 60, to reinvent himself the way he's been doing is to really stand for the potency of what I suppose 800 million Indians can do for themselves. So ladies and gentlemen, to really understand the spirit of entrepreneurship, please welcome Ronnie Screwvala. Thank you, Ronnie.
Good evening.
I don't know about us having the entrepreneurial spirit, but I can say we have tenacity. We've been chasing Ronnie for close to 2 years to make the time to come and do this. He's wanted to do it on a day when he has other things lined up in Delhi, but finally the lure of Algebra and an audience like you has brought him here on a Sunday. So a big thanks to all of you, actually.
I always kept saying weekday, and you kept saying Sunday, and I think we finally found the day.
So I've finally broken his landscape and brought him here on a Sunday. So, Ronnie, let me start with the fact that a couple of years ago, around the time that you sold UTV, you wrote a book about entrepreneurship and leadership and success. And in a way, it must have been a time of great reflection and distillation for you, because you'd put in 25 years, building businesses. So if you were, I'm going to ask everyone to buy your book, but if you were to really reduce your learnings into a nutshell, what did you learn from your life? What are the kind of key characteristics an entrepreneur needs? And speaking for yourself, what are the generic qualities? And what were your strengths and what were your liabilities as an entrepreneur?
So I think, firstly, the trigger for writing the book was actually two things. When I started off to become an entrepreneur, there was a social stigma. 25 years later, when I was talking to a lot of people and a lot of youngsters, I found that social stigma is still there. Huge. And it's not just in the small towns. I think it's even in the big and urban cities, where basically you haven't got the parental support. It's always looked at as an option, and at the younger generation, for a lot of people, they have that look about them from their parents that says, so you couldn't find yourself a good job, so now you're going to start working for yourself. And that struck me as something that needed evangelism. And I think the second one really is that we just do not talk enough about failure in this country. And I was and that's something that we should evangelize failure, because I think we look at it as a very very detrimental thing. So I think those were the two triggers really for me to sort of write the book at that point in time. If I have to sort of introspect for me, what were the things and the key learnings out there, I think the biggest thing is you can't time anything. And I think timing is about the most important part. And by that I mean, everyone thinks, for example, in entrepreneurship, a lot of people feel, is this the right time or not? And I think if you're sitting on the fence for more than 6 months, you're probably going to sit on the fence for the rest of your life. So I think that's something that should work with everyone. And I think the second one is when everyone starts making a deal with themselves and says, I'll give this 1 year or I'll give this 2 years, and then I'll see whether this works for me. And that's a recipe for failure. That's a recipe for not being successful in a business that has odds worse than the movie industry for really succeeding. And I think that is very, very critical, because if you start making a deal that says, I'm going to do this for 1 year or 2 years, you can't time your failures and you can't time your successes. So I think staying the course is about the most important part of being an entrepreneur. And it's a relentless job, and you need a lot of resilience.
So what about you personally? You know, when you look back, what were your strengths as an entrepreneur and what were your liabilities? And can you share some maybe incidents or decisions you made which would manifest both, you know, your strengths and your weaknesses?
So I think, well, I think my weakness constantly is this constant expectation of pace. And I think that is something that you need in the 21st century, but I think it's also contrarian in many ways. And I think that I've considered and introspected a lot, where when you're driving a lot of people with pace, the probability is that you get a lot of good decision making and you can move fast, but at the same time, you have issues in terms of being able to sort of take the right calls. And I think the second one is focus. I think just in India, the way our family businesses have run is we sort of hit the glass ceiling too early in life, in whatever form. So everyone starts a business, they haven't really figured out what the size of the market is, so you hit the glass ceiling. Now, the idea of a great entrepreneur is to break the glass ceiling, not to then diversify and say, I'll also do this, and I'll also do that. And I think I've been guilty of that as much as anyone else. And that's when you start losing focus. So diversification, then comes lack of focus. To me, those are the ones that if you can stay, the reason we don't have the absolutely massive companies in India, I think is the focus, that laser sharp focus where people feel I want to do this one thing, I want to do phenomenal, and our family businesses have not gone down that way. And I think the second one is the obsession of 51% control, where you don't feel you don't want to let go. There's a day on which you stop being an owner, and then you become a shareholder, and then you become a CEO, and then you become an entrepreneur. And I think if you can't segregate those, and you feel the only way I can control and be in that place is I own 51% of a company, you can't scale.
Ronnie, I'm going to remind you about this a few days later, okay?
Okay, all right.
Okay, that's just an aside.
So there's a difference between 50% and 51%.
Okay. Sorry, I lost my thread. Yeah, so when we were talking about, you know, just decision making, that when you're saying about this focus and letting go and give us an example, you know, when you've kind of lost a good opportunity or just made a bad entrepreneurial decision.
Multiple ones. And I think the focus would be if you did one thing and really scale that up. And I think part of the business, at least in media, when we started off, and you know, my wife is here, she was a co-founder, I was a co-founder, and we had one other third one. I think at that stage, it was so nascent that we couldn't really be in control of our destiny, and so we needed to diversify. That's what we thought then. But maybe in retrospect, if we stayed very, very clear on one or two aspects and scaled them up, it could have been slightly different. I think that's really...
So, you know, you've done so many diverse things. Is there kind of commonality to what has excited you about all these projects? You know, have the goals been somewhat similar? Is there some common characteristics to what has triggered you to take these things up as an entrepreneur?
I think it varies at different stages in your life and at the stage in the life of your business. Sometimes when you're younger, you're looking at things more opportunistically. Then you look at things more strategically. Then you start thinking of what is the impact I'm going to create. So I think in my second innings, obviously the criterion for both Zarina and myself is what impact are we creating, whether it's in education, whether it's in sport. I can't make a difference to cricket by being the 101 person, so why don't we look at Kabaddi and see what we can do there? So I think it's those kind of very singular approaches. As right now, the stage is what can we do to make a difference at scale?
So, I'm going to come to your various enterprises, but just in terms of, just changes like you're saying about from when you started out to where you're now, a very new distinctive thing that you're doing is that earlier you were a solo player, pretty much all your enterprises were self-driven. In your new enterprises, you've kind of gone with co-founders in every single project. So one, why that change? Why are you going with co-founders? And then being the kind of very individualistic person you are, what have you looked for in these co-founders? What is the temperament or the characteristics that you've looked for in them to feel that you can walk a journey together?
So actually that's not really true, because when I started UTV, and there was literally three of us, Zarina, Devan, and myself, and I remember a conversation where I took both of them to the Bombay Gym Club, and at that time, Zarina and I were not married, and I said, listen, I want to be a creative catalyst. I don't think all three of us can be in the creative business and be creatives. You all are going to be the creative brains. I'll bring about the catalyst and the business function. And then we worked out a co-founder relationship right there. And that was at a very, very early stage, in the very formative stage of UTV. You mentioned toothbrushes. We did toothbrushes, not toothpaste. It might be the same
big
thing
difference.
in terms
it's
of
like the shirt and hand difference Salman was making.
Right. But it's a big difference between shirts and hangers, So, in that context, I think the same would apply. There again, it was co-founders. I think today, in my second innings of what I want to do, I feel that the strengths that I can bring to the table would be if I worked with co-founders and didn't have an operational responsibility. But I think to me, it was also a personal preference. There were 3 or 4 personal preferences I had. Whatever I do, neither of us wanted to have an office 10 minutes away from our home, because we'd been driving 1 hour, 15 minutes for 25 to 30 years of our life, and we felt that was just draining on us to spend 2 hours or 2.5 hours in a car. The second one was I just didn't want to play an HR function. And I think when you're a CEO, 30% of your time goes, if not 50% of your time goes in HR functions. And I don't mean HR as in just HR, just everything to do with building teams. So to me, and day-to-day operations was something I just didn't feel I wanted to do. That's why the first criterion for me is if I can't find a co-founder, I won't get into that business.
So 2 quick questions before we move into your actual enterprises. One is that what quintessentially makes you an entrepreneur and not a hired professional? What about you from such a young age made you sure you wanted to be an entrepreneur?
So at that stage, I don't think I knew what. So at the time in which my father was insistent that I board a plane and do my chartered accountancy in the United Kingdom, and that 1 month I spent trying to convince them that I was not going to do that. Partly it was about, no, I'm not going to. At that stage, I was quite clear I wanted to do something on my own. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I think part of my theater upbringing as a hobby got me interested in media. So I think that was just serendipity. And I believe actually most of strategic decisions, 50% of them are serendipitous. So I think there's a lot of serendipity in almost, I think what I've done, even in my second innings, there's been a sort of fair amount of serendipity in that.
And also a sense that you can't work out anybody else's vision, nothing more visceral than...
Yeah, maybe that's the trend of thought that, I think that I realized when I sold, when we exited UTV and divested to the Walt Disney company, and I'd committed to do either 2 or 5 years to combine the 2 entities and work there. But I think at the end of 1 year, I said, I've got to move out from here. I think Zarina took that decision even quicker than I did. And I felt, no, media is something that I felt good about. But I think at the end of 1 year, I said, I've got to move out of here. And not for any other reason. There was a phenomenal multinational company offering a very entrepreneurial approach to situations. And I think when the person I was reporting to, which is the first time in my life I was reporting to someone, and that didn't bother me. I'd always worked for myself, and here I felt I was working for an organization. That didn't bother me. But what did, and when he asked me that, it just came out at the breakfast conversation when I said, I have to move on. And I said, I'm not good at implementing somebody else's vision. So maybe I'm the wrong guy for the job. And I think that what really spells out true entrepreneurship, outside of the fact that you need to be resilient, you need to do this. But at the end of the day, you have to act on your own vision, because that's the only thing that's going to get you up every morning. That's the only thing that's going to get you going every single day when you're going to face nothing but challenges.
So, the big tussle, I think, in being an entrepreneur and having a vision is that very often there'll be things that the market dictates and something that you viscerally feel you want to do or you want to break ground. So in that tussle between what the market is dictating and apparent wisdom, and your own desire to do something, how do you make the call? And again, like, can you share with us at some point when you've made a radical
I don't
call?
think anyone has that luxury, to be honest. I think it's a fallacious part here from anyone who wants to be an entrepreneur or be a leader to actually believe, oh, but this is the way I want to do it, but the market is determining the other way. In fact, if you're smart about entrepreneurship and if you are smart about leadership, you're going to have to take that into context. Now, if you're running a B2B business, which is not something where you're touching the consumer directly, that has a different fundamentals in how you run that business, because then you're working with 2 clients, 20 clients, or 200 clients. So everything is targeted towards that. When you're out there doing something for the consumer at large, that's a different mindset. More so than anywhere else, where you can't have the luxury that what
Is that really true? Like Steve Jobs, I would say, reinvented what the market was.
Yeah, so I think that's a different question. That can research and feedback and consumer behavior tell you that? No, I think as an entrepreneur, actually preempting trends is part of your job, right? And the people who have become super entrepreneurs are the ones who preempt trends. So I think in a Steve Jobs case, it was about not, I didn't do enough research, it's just that I preempted my own trend and went with that. So, but I can also tell you that the 99 cases where that didn't work for a lot of entrepreneurs for the one case that it did.
Okay.
So everyone shouldn't just draw on single inspirations and think that's going to define their lives after that.
Isn't that what drives you, that you think you might end up being that one inspirational story?
But it's a risk, and therefore, from that point of view, it can be a flop show, and sometimes it's a binary effect. When you play that kind of a game, you need to be ready for a binary impact of a zero-sum game, meaning it's either a success or a failure. There's no in-between on that. So a lot of people, when they look at businesses and how they want to grow, look at it with slightly risk-averse approach. But if you want to play the binary game, then it's a zero-sum game.
Okay, so we'll come back to some more generic approaches to entrepreneurship later, but just to get into your particular enterprises, you have a really diverse portfolio now, which is, like we said, from education to sports to back to cinema, as well as e-gaming and, of course, Swades Foundation. I'm going to come to the foundation second, but first up, just because of the cinema piece, that was what your footprint was already in. Normally, you've said you always want to move the needle. What brought you back into film production, and how is the vision different? And very interestingly, you've said that this time you've kind of categorized yourself into your intent is to tell the stories that you want to tell, the stories that need to be told, and stories that people will come to the theaters to see. What do you mean by that, and can you give examples of that?
So I think the first time when we were building a media and entertainment company, the first 10 years we were building a B2B company. And we were doing almost everything in media that anyone could do, from ad films and documentaries and airline in-flight programming, post-production studio, animation, producing shows for television, and many, many others. That's my reference to maybe lack of focus and a diversified approach. And I remember when we went public, and the first analyst call that I was on, and the penny dropped with me, because the questions that they asked, I couldn't answer 9 out of the 10 questions. And then suddenly I realized I wasn't in control of our own destiny. So we kind of morphed the entire company into a B2C space, and started our own broadcast channel, started a movie studio, started a game studio. So I think the point here was that in the first time we were building a media company, I think pretty much when you're running a business, and especially when it's got external shareholders or a listed company, 50% of what you're doing, you have to do, and 50% of things as an entrepreneur, you do what you want to do. So I think when I sort of divested the business, I felt that at least now I want to do 100% of what I would want to do. And I think that's the critical difference here. I think storytelling has also emerged. Audiences have evolved over the last 5 to 10 years. I remember when we entered the business, we were complete outsiders. And I think the first 6 movies that we did were complete and absolute flops. Everyone told us, you have no business to be in the business, get out of it. But again, I think an entrepreneurial approach was, I don't have a choice. I've already decided that I want to run a B2C business. I just do not have a choice. And I can't overemphasize for anyone who's looking at entrepreneurship or is an entrepreneur, how absolutely liberating it is to get there and say, I don't have a choice. Because that just puts a full stop. It just puts a back at the back of your chair that just does not allow you to recline at any given stage. So I think that you do not have a choice is very, very important, because then everything after that is forward and not backward thinking. And I think that really was at that particular point in time. And then we had movies like Swades, And then Rang De Basanti, for example, for us was a turning point. And it was against the wind from, it was headwind for us for a movie like Rang De Basanti, because at that stage everyone thought, wow, that's visionary. And I said, there's absolutely nothing visionary about us having done Rang De Basanti. Because at that time, when you had the Yash Chopras and the Karan Johars and that genre of movie and storytelling, to do a movie where 30% of the movie is a flashback, they're all male stars. Of course, Amir was there. You're taking on the government, and all 6 heroes.
You're setting him in a non-male category.
And all the heroes die at the end. And so, to me, it was a recipe for absolute disaster. Okay, but it was a turning point on a narrative. And I think today, 15 years later, or a little less than 15 years later, I feel the narrative is shifting. So to me, it was unfinished business after having divested. So it's not building a media company, but it's just telling stories.
So, again, just to push you on that point, because it's very interesting, those distinctions you've made. What are the stories you want to tell? What are the stories that you feel, audience will come to see? And
I think the younger audience today, and partly, you see, the audience trends have changed. And a lot of people, again, I'd like to address this issue here, where most people think technology is changing situations. And I'm saying to most people, first, the consumer is changing, or the audience is changing, depending on what business you're in. So, and everyone keeps talking, and I know in the cinema and the media business, everyone's saying, look at the impact technology is having. And I'm saying, no, look at the impact the audience is having, and what audiences are looking for, and what the younger generation is looking for. And I think the storytelling that they're looking for is entertainment high, but at the same time being real and contextual in what you want to do. And I think that's the combination that makes it very interesting to tell stories.
So you're backing a lot of biopics, and is that a...
So I think in the stories the stories that must be told, we're doing the biopic on Ram Jethmalani. I think we're doing a biopic on Sam Manik's show. We're doing a movie on the Uri attack and the surgical strikes after that. So there's that genre. And the second one, I think, is stories that we would love to tell. And I think a movie on Kabaddi, which I think is inspiring, or in that genre would be the third. And I think the third one is stories that you go to the movies for. So I think it just penned down as a vision statement. It sounded very nice. Then it sounded very visionary. So I thought, let's stick with it.
A biopic on Modi.
I think there's...
That story, Abhibi...
It's an emerging story.
It's an emerging story.
It is an emerging story. It is an emerging story. It is an emerging story.
So,
there are some people you can't give lifetime awards to before they've finished what they're out to do. So I think that's very important.
Okay. We'll come back to that conversation at the end of the conversation.
I'm from Bombay, so I don't make political statements.
Okay.
That's the privilege of everyone in Delhi.
So we'll come back to, just the digital disruption of films if you have time, Ronnie. But just to move to Swades Foundation, which has been a big passion in both you and Zarina's life. Again, it's very interesting that people have a sense. I mean, India doesn't have much of a culture of giving. But there is also a sense that you will only start to give when you reach a certain level of superfluity, and of wealth. But it's very interesting that you started the foundation, I think even before you were 30 years old. And so you've been running it for a long time. So what drove your philosophy of giving? Why did you set up Swadesh? What does it intend to do? And how is it different from, say, a gazillion other NGOs? What is the social impact you're trying to make that is different from
So just from a storytelling point of view, I guess if I were to do by default, I think it'll be a little bit to do with our Parsi genes, maybe. If I'm just going to sort of introspect as to why we started that. At that age and stage, it wasn't really important. I think it was part of culture building in an organization where we felt whatever we were going to do, 10% of our profits would go for a social cause. Now, at that stage, we weren't even making money. So it was a nice statement to make that 10% of our profits would go. So for a lot of people, they thought it was a trick question saying, oh, when you make profits, you'll devote that. And that's when we turned it around and said, well, look, we just got an office of 10,000 square feet, and 1,000 of that we took to an old age home and a creche. And that's how it started. And at that stage, but I think at that stage, so there are 2-3 parts in which I want to state this. There were 30 of us, but I think at that stage it set such a strong culture within the organization because it just felt everyone a sense of belonging. And I think Salman mentioned this a little earlier in his talk, that India cannot always be such a hugely capitalistic country because we always need to do the balance. And I think we shouldn't deter ambition, we shouldn't deter wealth creation, but I think the best way to do that is in a balanced manner. At that stage in age, I cannot for 1 minute profess and confess that was my altruistic moment. It just unfolded, that's how it happened. And for the next 15 to 20 years, that's what we went through. In fact, one of our first investors asked us that question that says, in the due diligence, KPMG said 10% of the profits are going to go to charity. What the hell is going on here? And there was no CSR rule at that time. And we convinced them and said, well, that's how we're going to do exactly what we were going to do. And he said, well, what about the years in which you don't make a profit? And I said, we're entrepreneurs. We'll figure that out at that particular point. But I think cut to when we divested our shares and sold to Disney, it was a conversation Zarina was sort of having. And I think, again, it's all serendipitous, right? Because she felt when she moved out of UTV, and Disney combined, where she wanted to do something, so she went out and did a 10 days course with Teach for India, and came back and said, I'm joining Teach for India. And that I felt quite panicky about, because we'd always worked together in some form or the other, and there was always a good security blanket of having that in a common vision. And so I think I just blurted it out at that point, and like I would, if there was a key person or a key co-founder who was leaving an organization, I want to retain them, I'd paint a different picture. So I said, look, why don't we take what we're doing here and take Swades to a completely different level? And I kind of articulated a vision statement which sounded very rosy, but it was more a retention strategy than an articulation.
Well, I'm going to ask you to spell that vision out, but what will be very interesting is, it's wonderful that you're mentioning how much Zarina has been a co-traveler with you. What has Zarina brought to the table as an entrepreneur that you have not been able to bring? What is the qualities she brings?
So I think when it comes to the media and entertainment part of the business, I think she's actually brought the focus, because I think for her entire life, she focused on the entire television sector. And when we were making television shows, it was disruptive and forward-thinking ideas. And when we were doing broadcasting, every time we wanted to start a new channel, there'd always be an idea that would come from her. And then I'd do the job of selling that channel to the Walt Disney company, and then back again, she'd come the next day and said, I don't know what you did with that. We should never have sold that channel, but here's another great idea. So I think that's pretty much that journey. But I think today, when we're looking at the social sector and in Swades, it's been an evolution for us also, because I think when we decided that we wanted to scale up, and a couple of things happened. I think the first thing we realized is that we need to do, and I didn't maybe finish what I wanted to articulate, that I think we kind of hit ourselves quite hard on this fact that we're not a giving country. And I can tell you that 6 years back, when we started this journey of meeting people, the sweat equity of the social work that's happening in this country is absolutely incredible. And we've seen that. So I think we have to value not just based on only 0.2% of our GDP is what we're doing, and the US does 2% of their GDP, because actually that's quite crap. Because if you see the 2% of their GDP, 80% of that goes to educational institutions that don't really need the funding, and they're doing the pension fund management for private equity. A lot goes to religious institutions, and very little goes to the actual core needy. So if you look at the sweat equity here in India, I think we represent 2% of GDP in cash and kind. So I don't think we should be that harsh on ourselves. Second, why are people still not given?
I think the crucial point to make there is sweat equity. There are a lot of good,
I agree, and I was coming to that. I knew you'd ask me that, but what about cutting a check, and what about the money?
Yeah. Because again, it's the people we are blind to, the ones we keep calling NGOs. It's the Aruna
So I think
Roys.
that's a little bit to do with all of us thinking, can we make a difference? And again, I go back to this day where we were sitting in the Delhi University in early January of 2006, and we were launching Rang De Basanti. And I think one of the reasons we did a movie like that is because we were sitting in that Delhi University with about 1,000 people there, and Amir Rakesh, who was the director, and myself were sitting there. And all the kids there were saying, that's all fine, this is all fine for you all, but I don't think we can make a difference. And I think that's one of the big problems that in the country we do have, because we have to change that perception for what we want to do, and I think we can make a difference. So in the social sector, I think for a lot of people who have money, they haven't been able to figure out who to give it to. I think that social sector also lacks trust, lacks scale, and lacks impact measurement. Now, the Gates Foundation spends 15-20% of their budgets just to measure that what they're doing is impactful. Here, I don't think we do that. So when I don't have a report card, I'd give you 10,000 rupees, but I'm not going to give you 10 lakhs, and I'm not going to give you 1 crore of rupees, because I'm not sure what report card you'll tell me. Second, for a long period of time, 35% of all funds raised for the social sector is spent towards raising the funds. And that's a huge leakage. And frankly, that's also in the US and many other places, where you just spend 35% of the money to raise that money, which is criminal. And I think if we can change those, a lot more people would give.
So, just again, before we move away to other things, that I was asking you to spell out what is the Swadesh vision. I know that you're trying to lift 1 million people out of poverty every 6 years, if I'm not mistaken. What are you doing to be able to
So I think the
pull that
homework
off?
that we did and met with about multiple NGOs across India and Bangladesh, where we were inspired very clearly with Professor Faisal and what he runs in Bangladesh, was that couple of things. One, in India, you need to be an entrepreneur and be involved and be an operating NGO. I don't think you can just cut a check and do anything else. So we were very clear, whatever we want to do, we want to be an operating NGO. We'd build our own staff and we'd execute on our own. Second, most people do it in silos where it's either water or health or education or toilets. We felt the 360-degree model was important because everything is so interconnected that you cannot make any permanent change or large impact if you're looking at anything else but a single sector. You can solve the water problem, but there are 5 other things that will happen there. You can solve and you can't solve education without you solving the basics. So it came very clear to us that we needed a 360-degree model. Again, enough naysayers who told us, you must be out of your mind, please don't attempt that model. But I think in our media days, we were quite used to being told no on a lot of things, and sometimes they were right, and sometimes we were right. But I think that's what we pursued. The third, to me, was scale, because I think you can create a model with 5 villages and 10 villages, but to create a model at scale is very challenging. So I think we've taken a 360-degree model, a concentric geography, which is fully interconnected, and looked at how we can make a permanent change and exit that geography. The first time we used the word exit, everyone was spooked. And I guess that was my commercial language of what I wanted to do. So we moved exit to the word empowerment, because exit sounded like we were going to abandon people. So it then became empowerment. But essentially, that's what you need to do. I think in our social work, the point is for 20 years, if I'm doing the same thing, I need to question, am I really doing the right social work? Because if I'm not moving the needle, if I'm not changing permanently something, what am I doing?
Sure. Again, we'll move to e-gaming, which is really a whole new vacuum that you spotted. But just one question there, that we have such a thin culture of giving, as I said, in this country. In all these years of working, and because of the network now that you've built amongst those who are, who have resources, have you tried to trigger a culture of giving? Is there a conversation you're trying to start amongst?
I think there are 3 or 4 very active associations. I know there are only 150 to 250 of the people who get together on those ones, but it's a start. So I think the last 3-4 years, Azim Premji has been a huge advocate, and he's really spearheaded many of these. And I think the CSR bill has made a big change, really a big change. It'll take its time. People have donated it, and then it's gone into foundations, so you'll never have all the ticks. But I think it's made a big change.
So let's move to e-gaming. Very quickly with the audience, that Ronnie is trying to create a completely new sport in India, which is going to give all our children who aren't doing well at academics a career choice. And I'm going to let Ronnie spell that out. But potentially this e-gaming market is like $500, $600 million. It's not something that you've really been involved with. How did you spot this vacuum? What is the scale of the game that you're trying to create in India? And again, it's interesting that unlike others who would look for venture funding and money from elsewhere, you're putting all of your own money into this. So what's driving that confidence?
So I think the primary first thing I think is about sport. I think we're the only country which is a single sport nation in the world. Outside of winning a war, the best thing that we can do for building a nation is really winning in sport. You can't get more national pride outside of winning a war than winning sports, winning Olympic gold medals. It brings winning the World Cup, whatever else. And we just do that in a sport which actually is becoming less and less important around the world. First, the world used to play cricket, then the Commonwealth countries used to play cricket, and now 90% of all revenues of cricket come from India, which is the statement even last week that was made. So we need to be a multi-sport country in the first place. And I think more than e-sport, to me, the excitement was when we came up with Kabaddi. Okay, and I think there was a group of about 7, 8 believers, after 7 years of waiting with no believers, to make a sport like that. So I think India needs at least 2 to 3 more sports for it to be phenomenally successful. The e-sport part, I know the word sport comes in there. For a lot of people who question me that what about games can be a sporting, because sports for everyone means you can't be sitting there and you need to stand up or you need to play a game. But it is something that I think, whether we like it or not, the millennium and the after millennium kids of today do not necessarily want to see, firstly they don't want to see it in the movie theater, second they don't want to see it passively. It's extremely interactive. So the future of storytelling is interactive. And I think we're looking at games more as first-person shooter games. That's changed. That we always think when we have games which about 5 people that are shooting at each other. But I think that world is changing also.
So, really? Okay. Okay. You have a flight to catch, but we have 10, 15
Yeah, I've got time. It's okay.
Okay.
Oh, you're doing it from the airport, or? No. No, that's fine.
Okay. You can always catch another flight as well.
No, I think that's the last flight.
Okay. So, but again, just spell out the scale. It's a shocking. I mean, we're always trying to stop our children from playing on video games. And you're really being the Voldemort here because you're now creating an entire new structure around it. And your intention is to bring 100 million people into this ecosystem. So can you just spell that out a little bit more?
I think today there are about 10 million hardcore gamers in this country and about 60, 70, what I would call casual gamers, the people that are sitting there and you're playing fun games. And I think the idea is to take that to 100 million. I think the context here is most sport anywhere in the world has become very, very popular because of television. And we've seen that here in cricket. Cricket otherwise was a 5-day tournament. The only reason it really got phenomenally popular was when it went onto television. And I think the digital medium is the right medium for esports, which is why I think the needle will move.
So just quickly now, before you actually miss your flight, the other thing that you've got into is the education space on digital. This is again, it's a big gamble because people really want kids and parents to go to school, but you're looking at digital education. Is that something that you feel will catch on in India? You've said somewhere that this could be 20x what UTV was valued at. What is the potential that you're seeing which others could possibly look at as well?
So I think I would like to say that with absolute conviction that amongst any and every business that I've looked at, this one I feel most positive about because I think the size of the market, the absolute compelling need for learning, because our definition is that no longer is learning over at 21, 22, and 23. Everyone who's at 30, 40, 45, 50, including 60, is going to have an ongoing learning experience. And that learning cannot stop at any given stage. It's a must. Because otherwise, we're going to be an anachronism, whoever's sitting there. And you can't just blame it on technology and say, I don't understand tech, because there's no such thing. You don't need to be a techie to understand that. So we strongly believe that actually learning is going to be an ongoing process. Second, while you could do that when you were a student, you can never do that by taking time off. Very few people have the luxury for taking time off. So the basic foundation is, the only way you can do that is online, because then you can do it on your own time. And today, if you see the statistics of what the market we're playing, for example, there are about 125 million students who should be in post-graduation, and only 25 million people are. And that's not because we don't have the right universities, and we don't have faculty at scale, and it's also not the affordability, but it's mostly that at least 60% of them need to take a job at a very early stage in their career. Once you take a job and you haven't gone to your best level of education, then you're going to stagnate. Then people are going to come in from the outside, and that's going to create its own revolution or disappointment, disillusionment. And therefore, we think it's a phenomenal market.
Sure. If there's a minute or two, we'll come back to this because I wanted to ask you a couple of questions on education and this great gap between not just the fact that there's unemployment, but unemployability. But we'll come to that. Just because this was about entrepreneurship and there are a lot of entrepreneurs here, what do you make of the entrepreneurial ecosystem in this country? Is it supportive enough? Are governments doing enough? What are the key changes that you think need to be made? And you've been a mentor to entrepreneurs as well. What is the role you see for yourself?
I don't think a government can do anything for entrepreneurship because that just is exactly diametrically opposite of what an entrepreneur should be, because it's a very, you've got to start, you've got to be, whether you're doing a kickstart or an ignition start every morning, whichever way you want to do that, but it's your own start. I don't think a government can be a catalyst, and I think if you ask me today, what we're doing here and what the campaigns as far as Startup India and the others are concerned, it is evangelizing that. So I would say at least they've done a great job at evangelizing. That means the conversation in rooms across Chandigarh, Lucknow, Delhi, or wherever else is, okay, if our Prime Minister says maybe we should become an entrepreneur, it's not such a bad idea, and maybe my son or daughter should go out and do it. So I think the evangelizing is the maximum that we can do. I don't think the government can start creating funds and giving out funds to people. I think it'll be a disastrous situation. 5 years later, there'll be inquiries because obviously 9 out of 10 businesses fail. So there's absolutely no business for a government to be in there. I think it's an ecosystem that has to start on its own. I think the job of an entrepreneur is to create multiple jobs. And I think for a lot of people in India, we look at entrepreneurship as a almost, it's always been the kirana shop has been the entrepreneur, and the small family business be the entrepreneur. And now we need to look at it at a different scale.
You've been wanting to change the nomenclature somewhat from startups to first-generation entrepreneurship. What's the difference? Has startups acquired a slightly, a kind of profligate air that you take other people's money, you create bubbles, you cut and you run? Is that different from first-generation entrepreneurship?
I think there are two parts to that. I think just the first generation was to differentiate between family businesses where the next generation was to take that forward and being a first-generation entrepreneur. So I think that's the differentiating in that. I think today the success formula that the media and all of us give to entrepreneurship is just based on the level of funding that we raise. And I think that's very dangerous because that's not a badge of honor. That actually sits in your liability side, not on the asset side of your balance sheet. So I think this whole context of saying I'm successful because I raise funds is a recipe for disaster, because actually that's been an ecosystem that is self-fulfilling right now. Investors start saying take more money. And when you look at that, and I've sat in boardrooms and I've said, but this company is going to be turning profitable in 3 months. And they're saying, that's right, why don't we give it 100 crores more? And I said, if you give this entrepreneur 100 crores more, he's going to go back into a loss, because what's he going to do with it? He's going to spend it. So I think this whole ecosystem of entrepreneurship here has been one of raise funds, burn, raise funds, burn, raise funds, burn. And it's become a badge of honor. So the only badge of honor has been about that. And that to me is a big, big caution mark for a lot of people.
So just last question, that at 60, after selling Disney, and as I said, for a lanky boy who started out in theater, you were sitting on more than anyone could have dreamt of. You could have had a very leisurely life, invested in other people's work. Why did you end up opening up this many arenas of battle, and why are you busier than you were before you were 60? What drove you back into entrepreneurship?
But I think everything else that you described is very boring, so it has to be this. I think it would be sheer and absolute boredom. I think it's a complete la-la land, fantasy land, where everyone thinks that just because capital has been raised, that you can then have a sort of a glass in your hand and sit in the Bahamas.
It's not that 60 is the new 20.
I think 60 is the new 40. I wouldn't say it's the new 20.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, Ronnie.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great way to end our season. It's great takeaway. And I think there were lots of takeaways for us 6 women who are trying to do this entrepreneurship. And thank you very much. We'll be back in July. Have a wonderful summer break. Thank you.